Okay, how the fuck did I end up on YouTube? April is Autism Acceptance Month, and I'm autistic, and I want to info dump. And writing articles and blog posts doesn't really work when people don't read anymore. So indulge my somewhat pretentious impulse to educate by joining me on a little lesson on media literacy, because some of you need it. Did you read that on the internet? This is going to be the first in a series of videos I'll be releasing this month. Don't expect this much regularity for future videos because it won't happen. I do too much. But that brings me to a question you might be asking. Who the fuck am I? Well, let me introduce myself. I'm Dev. I use they and he pronouns, and the most succinct description of myself I can give you is I'm a fucking weirdo. And by that I mean I'm a disabled, transmasculine, Indo-Trinidadian, Guyanese, Canadian, multidisciplinary artist and educator from Toronto. I've made short experimental documentaries, podcasts, and online radio programs, written articles, essays, fiction, and poetry, and developed and facilitated workshops, presentations, and panels about disability, gender, race, storytelling, media, and a whole bunch of other stuff. I have a website and stuff that you can check out if you want to know who you're giving your time to, but if you do know me, you know that I spend a lot of time thinking about media. Like, too much time. If you've ever spent time with me, I've probably accidentally given you an overzealous lecture about the themes and figurative devices of classic literary texts like Gilmore Girls, Riverdale, or Moulin Rouge at least once. I made a true crime podcast and a horror podcast for free. Now, at the end of last year, I just kind of happened upon that whole plagiarism and YouTube video. I didn't know anything about this guy, and I've barely touched this account in like 10 years, but I ate that shit up. Yeah, it's nearly 4 hours long, but it's my new comfort watch. But actually, this video essay is a true masterpiece in my opinion. It brought me back to what I consider the glory days of YouTube. Pre-monetization and before smartphones and social media got us all in a chokehold. You know, back when people were too embarrassed to tell their employers they had a YouTube channel because the internet was for weirdos and freaks.
Internet is really, really great.
For corn.
But beyond the absurdist prop gags, classic millennial humor, and strategically used jump cuts that really speak to current issues around online literacy, as H-Bomber Guy, or Harris, breaks down the logic behind online plagiarism and the non-apologies that come after being caught, the patterns he identified also reminded me of someone else. My ex.
Garbage day! Huh? No!
For context, my ex is an abusive piece of donkey doo-doo. Anyways, he's also a queer stand-up comic, coincidentally also with a business degree, who posts a lot about social justice on his social media. Now, the blatant Darvo strategy Somerton used following his plagiarism callouts was uncannily similar to when I called my ex out for his abuse, sure, but it was more than that. My ex would say and post things online that made it seem like he was well versed in what he was saying, but the more I paid attention, the more I felt like he didn't know what he was actually saying. If I ever asked him questions, he'd get tangled up in the holes of his own arguments. When it came to harm he caused, I'd started off accepting his explanations because I figured if he was going to lie about something, wouldn't he at least pick a better lie? That is, until he would contradict himself to justify some other new lie he was trying to get away with. Then I started to remember more things about my ex. Like the time he told me that another comedian had falsely accused him of stealing their material, until eventually he admitted that, okay, yeah, he'd used the same premise, but he'd improved on it. Or the time I once heard him giving the same advice I'd given him a few days before to a friend on the phone, though to hear him say it, you'd think that he not only came up with it all by himself, but that he had ever actually followed it himself. Or how the only people who ever seemed to comment on the few jokes he'd post online seemed to still have the maturity where just saying penis was enough to elicit shocked laughter.
There's kids around.
There are no kids around.
Penis!
Penis!
You having fun?
Yeah.
But that's not why I wanted to make this video. In the first half of the plagiarism video, Harris breaks down and analyzes the so-called plagiarism apologies from a YouTuber named Philip. He goes over the vague, cryptic language to describe the allegations, the deflection onto the accusers, the convenient omissions, and explanations of insecurities used to evoke undeserved sympathy. I wasn't just reminded of my ex. I was also reminded of Twitter discourse. When I was in my teens and early 20s, I tried to get on OG Twitter, but it was difficult and complicated. At the time, virality on any platform was mostly reserved for celebrity accounts, but occasionally a seemingly average, normal person would sweep across the internet. Except they usually weren't normal and average. They were people who had specialized knowledge in a specific field. They were aspiring filmmakers and writers and journalists and scientists and academics, which sounds normal and average if you neglect to mention their intense passion for their subject. But over the last decade or so, and exponentially more so after 2020 and the flood of formerly offline people discovering online communities, expertise increasingly has become less important than relatability, and knowledge feels like it's moving backwards. While certain buzzwords like intersectionality, collective care, and disability justice enter the mainstream, the core theory and expertise seem to be stripped from them and misused to align with relatable experiences. Not only that, people were no longer coming to their own opinions after falling down the rabbit hole of online research where you started off looking up some innocuous trivia about your favorite show and ended up learning some weird obscure history about the symbolism of foot fetishes or something. It always comes back to feet. Now people are forming opinions off a single viral tweet, even making criticisms that were already addressed within the thread of the tweet. It's getting to the point where people are repeating talking points and facts almost verbatim from each other without ever looking deeper into what they're actually saying. But because they say it so confidently and with so much conviction, a lot of people don't question them, as long as it feels relatable. Being a 30-year-old millennial who grew up consuming media embedded with Gen X nihilism and their hipster obsessions with obscurity and individuality, it hadn't occurred to me until now that there's a whole generation of youth growing up believing this is how the internet has always functioned, which is why media literacy is so important to talk about. So, let's get into it. I'm not trying to talk shit or anything, but I really feel like a lot of people don't actually understand what it means to be literate. I don't think it's necessarily their fault, though. I think it's a little discouraged on a societal level to actually be literate. The social media game isn't designed to reward literacy. When I was a kid, I remember I was taught that literacy meant your ability to read or write. But what does that actually mean? Truthfully, it's very much the same thing as language fluency, though we often focus on specifically written language, and it's usually through a colonial lens of assuming we're talking about English as a first language by default. But rather than thinking of it as reading and writing, let's think of it as understanding and communicating instead. Let me break it down, even if you feel like you know it already. First, let's think about reading. Reading literacy used to refer to being able to recognize letters and words, but now it's used to refer to our ability to understand what we read or our reading comprehension. According to the International Association for the Evaluation of Educational Achievements research for educators, complete reading comprehension has 4 main processes. 1. Focusing on and retrieving information explicitly stated in the text. 2. Making straightforward inferences. 3. Interpreting and integrating ideas and information. And 4. Evaluating and critiquing content and textual elements. To put it more simply, being able to understand a text means we first have to understand the words it uses, make connections between the ideas we're given, as well as make connections to what we already know before we decide whether or not we agree or disagree. Let's do an example. Say the text is, "Cats are the best. They are very cute and fun to pet." We figure out what the words the author has chosen mean and how they are used in phrases and sentences. We can read the words, "Cats are the best. They are very cute and fun to pet." We can understand what they mean. Cats are the best, and cats are cute and fun to pet. This will depend on your own vocabulary, so if you're unfamiliar with a word or how it's being used, you won't be able to reach this level of comprehension without learning those unfamiliar words. Then you need to be able to make connections between the ideas given to you that aren't directly said. In this case, that would be that cats are the best because they are cute and fun to pet. After that, you then have to figure out what the message is using what you already know. So, when we're reading it, we're asking ourselves, how does this fit what I know? For me, I read this and can decide for myself that the author believes cats are the best out of house pets because I know that many people have strong opinions about what animals make a good pet, usually reduced down to either cats or dogs. I can also understand that the author prefers cats because they believe they're cute and fun to pet because I know those are subjective traits, as in they are defined by the author's measure of cute and fun, which may not align with everyone else's. But again, this relies on what information I already had available to me. And then finally, to completely understand what you're reading, you have to be able to evaluate and critique, which actually means looking at the text in order to form your own opinion on it. Now that we understand that this is the author's opinion, we can then decide whether or not we agree with the author, and if we have enough information in order to do so. Now, I might agree with these statements, but I also know that it's also based on my subjective experience of cats. I also find them cute and fun to pet, but I also know that others may not agree, and that could be valid too. For example, someone who's had bad experiences with getting scratched by cats may not find them fun to pet, which is fair. Or someone else may not use cuteness or petability as a measure of what they prefer about their pet. But more than that, I have to think about context and intent. I can look at this text and know that I don't have enough context to concretely decide whether or not I agree or disagree with the author. Where are they writing these statements? Are they sharing an opinion on their personal social media? Then, okay, yeah, I can agree with that because I personally agree. But even if I didn't, that's representative of my opinion, not theirs. And their social media is for sharing their opinions. But what if it's in a textbook called something like The Definitive Guide to House Pets? In that case, I wouldn't agree because I know that it's just the author's opinion, not a fact. I also have the experience from having conversations with other people to know that not everyone shares that opinion or uses the same criteria to judge a pet's suitability for themselves. But seeing the text on its own as it is, with no other context, if I were asked if I agreed or disagreed, I'd have to answer, I don't know. I'd need more information. Which actually brings me to another question we have to ask ourselves. Am I who this text was written for? Do I have access to the information I need to understand this? Not everything is meant for everyone, and that's okay. People aren't universal, so there's really no such thing as universal communication. Even if we're all speaking English, there may be dialectical or cultural differences in how we say some words or what metaphors or colloquial expressions we use. Or you may have different experiences or interests that we may be more or less familiar with. There are even formal and informal ways to communicate ideas. Sometimes we don't understand or agree with things because they weren't meant for us in the first place. But it's important that we're able to identify when that's the case before we take up space with our critiques and analyses. Before I move on, though, I want to take a moment to talk about the idea of objectivity. Oxford Languages defines objective as not influenced by feelings or opinions in representing or considering facts. The idea of objectivity came out of the Age of Enlightenment, as the Western world apparently moved away from religion and toward science. This idea was used to justify a lot of racist, eugenic, sexist, and transphobic things that more recent science has spent a lot of time debunking. Truthfully, we all view and consider and interpret facts through our own lens of experiences. So how can we then communicate those facts without applying that lens? This was a question that sociologists, anthropologists, and scientists began to grapple with in the mid-20th century as feminist and anti-colonial perspectives began to emerge in academic spaces. The result was the theory of reflexivity, to reflect on how our positionality, or the identities and experiences that shape how we see the world, impacts how we interpret the information we come across. For example, in 2017, physical anthropologists proved that the skeleton of a warrior that archaeologists assumed to be male was actually female. Holly Norton wrote for The Guardian, Hayden Sterna Johnson et al. Do not equivocate in their statements that, for over a century, this individual was misidentified as male because archaeologists, acculturated in Western society with strictly defined gender roles, view men alone as warriors or soldiers or wielders of violence. But this can also lead to more severe consequences too. The Age of Enlightenment also led to race sciences like phrenology, which linked physical traits with intelligence, and the eugenics movement, a bunch of scientists trying to breed the perfect race, which also involved killing off anyone with undesirable traits like disability, not being white, or queerness. This is why it's so important to be thinking critically about what we consume as fact or opinion. But how do we actually do that? First, look at where the information is coming from. Who created it and why did they make it? What do they want people to do with it? Why should you trust them? But also, let's be careful about how we're judging expertise. As we saw with the eugenics movement, there's a long history of experts who've helped spread misinformation. And a lot of history and progress has been missed because different perspectives were ignored or excluded. People can be experts on their own lived experiences as well. If you don't know much about the creators, can you find any information about them? Are they associated or affiliated with any organizations or groups? Are they trying to sell you something? How do other people in their field or community feel about them and their work? Do people agree or disagree with them? What kind of people agree with them? Are they people who have experience with the subject or some other relevant perspective? Does its platform have any documented standards and practices? Do they respond to criticisms and critiques, and how well do they handle them if they do? You don't have to be able to answer all of these questions right away, but I suggest taking anything you learn with a grain of salt if you can't figure out at least a few of them. Then look at the information. How old or new is the information? Has any information been proven or disproven since it came out? Do they offer anything to support their claims? Do they mention where they got their information or reference any other sources of information? Can you check those sources for yourself? Can you find other sources that agree or disagree, and can you understand why they do or don't? Are there any perspectives that are getting left out? And again, you don't have to be able to answer all these questions. I'm not making a moral judgment if you don't know. But still, consider that when you reshare or boost or talk about it with others, because there will always be the possibility that you're wrong. What I like to do before I comment or reply or quote somebody else online is ask myself, how would I feel if I was proven wrong, and how certain am I that I can't be? Now, as a writer, I can tell you that when it comes to what defines good or bad writing, is the author's ability to give the reader the information and context that they need to understand what the author wants to say. This means that you have to know what you're saying, why you're saying it, who you are saying it to, and how they might interpret the information. I'm sure we've all experienced at some point or another a time that we wrote something that seemed very clear to us, but then got completely misinterpreted by the people we wrote it for.
But what does it mean?
And that's because we were writing with ourselves in mind, not our audience. So we have to think about how our audience uses language. What languages do they even speak? What are their values? What do they already know or believe? And what will they find relatable? So that's how you define written literacy, but what about media? Not all of it's written. The chapter Theories of Reading Comprehension from IEA's Research for Educators also says, as early as preschool and kindergarten, children develop language skills, such as the ability to generate and memorize sentences and use their vocabulary knowledge, factors that both predict initial reading comprehension ability and its growth. Basically, the language skills we apply to reading and writing also apply to how we listen and speak. These are basically your critical thinking skills, and literacy can apply to any kind of specialized knowledge. How well or easily you're able to use a computer relies on your computer literacy. How well or easily you'll be able to make or understand a film will depend on your film literacy. And how well or easily you'll be able to make or understand visual art will depend on your visual literacy. Okay, so to be media literate, you need to know what exactly is media. What counts as media? In the broadest sense, it's anything that's made to be consumed by an audience. That includes newspapers, books, films, art installations, Instagram posts, TV shows, websites, zines, video games, podcasts, YouTube videos, the list goes on. I used to study anthropology, so I'm taking the social scientific approach of culture as text, which was popularized by anthropologist Clifford Geertz. Media helps inform our ideas about the world and the people around us, which in turn impacts how we perceive the world and how we interact with it. And most media has an end goal they're trying to get out of their audience, including retaining audiences, selling products, swaying people towards specific ideas. Although digital media is a little different, since a lot of what's online now is user-generated, and its accessibility and reach can target very niche or underrepresented markets. But the speed with which it can be produced has, in my opinion at least, altered our perception of process, purpose, curation, and appreciation. When it comes to different types of media, the most important thing you can understand is that each kind of media has its own established, even if evolving, language, process, and skill sets involved in making each one. Kind of like how when you watch enough crime procedurals, you start to pick up on some kind of formula they seem to follow, because they do. These are not necessarily rules that you have to follow, but rather time-tested structures you can build off of. You have to be familiar with the forms of media you're working with if you want to truly understand or make it. Now, this doesn't mean that you have to be formally trained or have a degree or something. It often just takes a lot of practice. And if you're still on your journey, that's okay too. I just urge you to pay attention to what's already been made, what's being made now, what your particular audience wants, and if you have all the information and skills that you need to be the one to make it. If you don't, how can you fill those gaps? Do you need to collaborate with someone else? Do you need to practice using a subject you're more familiar with? Do you need to step out of your comfort zone? And do you know where to set your limits when stepping out of it? You also don't have to do any of this questioning or researching if you don't want to. You can just enjoy the media that you enjoy. That's fine too. But if you aren't willing to do it, or don't see the value in doing it, then at least remember that there are people who do and are willing to do it. So if that's the case, maybe just leave it up to us then. Thanks for watching. This is my first video essay, so I'm still figuring out my style and process. We're learning together. In part 2, I'll get more into the history side of things. If you want to support my work, I finally put together my Patreon. I'll put a link in the description. And don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Catch you later.